You saw this slide in my last lecture on French Gothic cathedrals, but now we're zooming in, first on sculpture and then on stained glass and the decorative arts. So let's begin with the western or so-called royal portal of the famous cathedral at Chartres. The royal portal is actually one of the last Romanesque bits of Chartres Cathedral, incorporated into the high Gothic church constructed after the devastating fire of 1194. The royal portal sculptures, especially the Jamb sculptures, are widely considered to be among the greatest early Gothic works. Before we look at this sculpture in more detail, let's return to the White Garment of Churches video for an overview. So moving now to the western or royal portal and these Jamb statues of Old Testament kings. As the video notes, these figures are fully attached to their pillars, but they are not just a substitute for the pillars. Compare them with the Greek caryatid, which actually did serve as a column. Yet while these royal portal figures are clearly attached, or remember the term, engaged, they still stand out from the pillars with greater independence and higher relief than we saw in Romanesque sculpture. The Jamb statue on the right, for example, is from the Romanesque church at Moissac that we studied, or at least looked at in the last chapter. It offers a useful comparison. What difference do you see? Well, clearly St. Peter is flatter. He is also more contorted, less majestic and comforting. I think he has a slightly Byzantine look to him, in fact. Let's zoom in on the faces of these two figures. What else do you notice? Well, again, the Chartres figure is more three-dimensional, also somewhat less stylized, and I would say that his face is more serene, while the Romanesque St. Peter appears more troubled. As I've noted, Gothic Christianity is simply more optimistic than Romanesque Christianity, more focused on the good news of salvation, somewhat less focused on the bad news of judgment, although the judgment part does not go away. Still, these are the earliest Chartres Jamb statues, and they really still show many Romanesque elements. So what are some of those elements? Well, the figures are still very frontal. Indeed, the Chartres figure is really more rigid and frontal than the statue from Moissac. Both figures are elongated, and their clothing relies very heavily on line rather than the contours of the body. You don't really have that much of a sense of a body being there, although interestingly, I would say St. Peter shows somewhat more body contours. Peter is likewise moving. Again, this is this statue on the right. Still, his body is unnaturally contorted. Look at that left hand. And the Old Testament kings and queens from Chartres are unnaturally still. Either way, these are not yet naturalistic depictions of the human body. So here's the tympanum over the central portal of the royal portal at Chartres. By the way, you are not going to need to memorize exactly which portal is which. And a figure like this, I think even recognizing that Chartres, you would probably not be asked. But Chartres Cathedral is nevertheless a very, very important work. Interestingly, next year on the new exam, it's the one Gothic cathedral that's featured. At any rate, what do you see on this tympanum? Well, there's Christ enthroned within a mandorla. It's the Last Judgment again. He's surrounded by the symbols of the four evangelists. Below him in the lintel, remember that's that bar over the door below the tympanum, we see the 12 apostles. The composition, the subject, the elongated, rigidly frontal figures, all of these seem Romanesque, although maybe the figure of Christ is slightly less forbidding than similar Romanesque statues at Moissac and Vézelay. I tried to get close-ups. It's tough since the face of Christ on the Last Judgment tympanum at Autumn is very weathered. But I think the Chartres version does look a little more human, if not necessarily entirely sympathetic to human failings. The tympanum above the right door shows Mary as the throne of heaven, holding Christ on her knee. Again, that was a very common way of depicting Mary, especially in earlier work in Byzantine and Romanesque. Below that, you see various scenes from the life of Mary. The presentation of the temple, the Annunciation by the angel Gabriel, The visitation, that's when Elizabeth comes to see Mary. When Mary is pregnant, Elizabeth is John the Baptist's mother. The nativity or birth of Christ, and the annunciation to the shepherds. You will have a benefit, by the way, in knowing these Bible stories. Take advantage of it. If you see a narrative when you on the AP exam, explain what's going on in the story. Don't assume that they assume that you know. Again, I want to note that Mary is a much more central figure in Gothic art, and again is part of this more approachable religion of the era. Even more important are signs of high medieval humanism in the lower right and left-hand corners. Any guesses about who those figures represent? Well, in the lower right-hand corner are figures of Pythagoras and Donatus, a Greek teacher of rhetoric who tutored St. Jerome. He was the one who translated the Bible into Latin. The figure in the lower left-hand corner, interestingly enough, is Aristotle. So here's a clearer picture of Aristotle on the bottom left. The woman above him, by the way, is a representation of logic, a very, very important topic for the scholastics, that is, the Christian university professors of the High Gothic era, whose intellectual effort above all was to reconcile Aristotelian logic and reason with Christian revelation. The figure on the right is Pythagoras. So the church is making its peace with classical learning, indeed forming an alliance in the great Christian universities such as the University of Paris and Oxford and Cambridge universities in England. Just to finish up this amazing royal portal, here's the tympanum above the left door. We see Christ ascending to heaven, accompanied by angels. There are signs of the zodiac and labors of the months along the archivolt. Remember, that's the circular portion immediately above the central tympanum or lunette. There are also 10 of the apostles present in the lintel. Moving now from the west to the north and then the south portals, and again, I want to emphasize that you do not need to know the specific geography of Chartres. There are limits even to the College Board's willingness to torture you. But now we're also moving forward almost a century to the period after Chartres was rebuilt along Gothic lines, and that's what you do need to know. In Northern Europe, it was common for the iconography on the north side of the church to focus on Old Testament themes, with stories of the lives of the saints and the Gospels on the south side. Any guesses as to why that would be? Well, the north side tends to be darker and the south side lighter. So we move from the darker, not fully informed era of the Old Testament to the lighter era of the New. At any rate, what we see here from left to right are the statues of Melchizedek, Abraham and Isaac, Moses, Samuel, and King David. So let's compare the newer figures on the right from the royal portal carving to the royal portal carvings a century earlier on the left. Note that both portray Old Testament figures. So what has and hasn't changed? The figures are still elongated. The heads are still disproportionately large. In fact, maybe even more so in the newer pieces. They still rely very heavily on line to depict the bodies. Still, the later Old Testament figures are more natural and more expressive. They are no longer rigidly frontal, and their faces are less stylized and more individualistic. So what changes do you see now? To me, it's almost like the story of Pinocchio. Someone has breathed life into these statues. They not only come very close to freestanding three-dimensional statuary, these figures are actually communicating with each other. And here also on the south transept, we see St. Theodore portrayed as a Christian knight in the cloak and chainmail armor of the Gothic Crusaders. In other words, as a contemporary of this period. Notice how natural the pose is. It really almost veers toward contrapposto in the somewhat more relaxed stance. The handsome young face is idealized, but I would argue it's also more individualistic, really more individualistic than the Greek spear bearer. We're moving away from Chartres, by the way. This is Amiens Cathedral. But note in this depiction of Christ, we see a statue that is almost entirely free of its architectural setting, although the architectural canopy above his head represents, as did the cathedral, the most modern Gothic style. By the way, here's a hint. Both Gothic statues and Gothic illuminated manuscripts will sometimes have illustrations of a cathedral. If you see an illustration that's clearly in the Gothic style ornate stonework, you're getting a real hint as to the period of the illustration or the statue. Use all the help you can get. At any rate, here again we see not the youthful good shepherd of early Christian art, not the Christ Pantocrator or world ruler of Byzantine art, or the fierce and solemn Christ as judge presiding over the last judgment. This is the gentle, benevolent, approachable Christ of the humanist high Middle Ages. In my next lecture, I'll talk a little bit more of this and the philosophy of St. Anselm. But basically, this is the Christ who knows what it means to be human and sympathizes with our human failings. This is very characteristic of Gothic art and a way that the art reflects religious beliefs and practices, something you're asked to do, right? So we saw the first hints of conversation among figures on Chartres' Porch of the Confessors. This is a high Gothic rendering of the angel Gabriel announcing Jesus' birth to Mary and Mary's visit to John the Baptist's mother Elizabeth. For this one, full-fledged gossip is broken out among the figures. What other changes do you notice? Well, the drapery is much less linear. It's much more natural. And are those real knees and hips we see poking through? The classical influence is so obvious and strong that art historians think that actual Greek statues, or at least Roman copies of actual Greek statues, were used by the artists. By the way, these two sculpture pairs were produced by different artists. The artist on the right modeled his figures in medieval dress. By the way, it's on your left. That's always confusing. The artist on the right has chosen, the artist on the left, I mixed this around in my own slide notes, has figures in medieval dress. The artist on the right has chosen classical dress and much more elaborate drapery. The visitation refers to the visit that John the Baptist's mother Elizabeth paid to Mary when she was pregnant with Jesus. You need to know these terms. Note again the heavy focus on Mary, which is even clearer in this beautiful and really delicate and moving statue of Mary as a beautiful young woman and as a loving mother. Note the elegant curvature. This reflects the court style of Louis IX or St. Louis. Do you remember the stained glass splendor of his chapel? This is Mary as a queen, complete with jeweled crown. Notice too how young and approachable she seems. So I'll finish up this with an overview of French Gothic sculpture with another of those helpful summary slides. I'm not quite sure why this building is included in the French Gothic section of the textbook or in this set of slides, but it's worth noting that the Gothic style was not just used for churches. I wish I had more time to talk about medieval guilds, but let me just note that artists were no longer exclusively or even primarily monks. Most of the great Gothic cathedrals were constructed and decorated by skilled members of craft guilds who carefully controlled quality, production techniques, and, for what it's worth, prices. This ornate and expensive building signals just how powerful and successful those guilds could become. And here's the private home of a very wealthy Frenchman. Again, you see the obvious Gothic flourishes. Now we get to the really fun part of Gothic art. So in this next video clip, you're going to get a quick review of Gothic architectural innovations and a look at Chartres' spectacular stained glass windows. On the left, you see Mary as the throne of heaven. That should be a familiar image by now. Note the frontal composition, the stiff figures that echo Byzantine art, but with a softer, gentler expression that's pure Gothic. The rose window on the right is held together by an elaborate stone armature. We've seen it on the facade from the outside. Here's a close-up of Mary's face. And no, she doesn't have a beard. It does look like it a little. And here are some more scenes from the huge stained glass window dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who was the patron saint of the Church of Chartres. The worship of Mary became much more important in the Gothic High Middle Ages. As I've noted, Marian imagery explodes. Again, it's part of this Gothic humanism. Christ, the judge of the world, is giving away to a more human, more approachable Christ. And what could be more approachable and more human than a baby with a young, beautiful mother, or for that matter, the mother herself? This is also a hint. If the College Board throws a medieval Mary at you, and it's not Byzantine, it's probably Gothic. Here at the top of the huge panel is another image of Mary enthroned as Queen of Heaven. Again, a majestic subject popular from Byzantine era through Baroque, which you won't encounter for a few weeks. Relax. You're a little less likely to get a question about Gothic illuminated manuscripts, partly because there's so much spectacular Gothic architecture competing for the College Board examiner's attention. But what's interesting about this, it's a master mason sketchbook. And you notice he is obviously very interested in geometry, a critical element of Gothic architecture and the Christian humanism and revived learning of the High Middle Ages. And it is possible that you would get a Gothic Moralized Bible image. Moralized Bibles paired Old and New Testament scenes and then drew moral illustrations from the stories. In the picture on the left, you see God as the master geometer, an image we'll see revived in the 18th century Enlightenment, and again shows the recovery of much classical learning in the High Middle Ages. The later Renaissance historians may have called this age Gothic as an insult. In fact, they way underestimated both the sophistication of the Gothic art and thinking, and frankly, the continued influence of classical works. At any rate, on the right, the dedication page showing the devout King Louis IX and his wife is notable for the way it clearly channels stained glass design. You may recall that the Rayonnant style was truly over the top, ultra-decorative, even busy late Gothic architectural style. This illuminated manuscript captures some of the same vibrancy and, frankly, some of the busyness. Do you remember why this story was so popular? Do you remember the vocabulary term, Rayonnant? Well, the angel's announcement that Abraham would have a son prefigures the Annunciation of Marian. Oops, that was the vocabulary term I was getting at. And given this era's greater wealth, it's no surprise that luxury arts also flourished. Jousting was a popular pastime, captured in this exquisite ivory carving. In my last lecture, we're going to finally get out of France and see how Gothic art spread and morphed as it traveled to England, Germany, and Italy.